This was the era of bold experiments, where new chemicals promised convenience and exotic ingredients seemed endlessly intriguing. But not every culinary adventure proved safe. Today we're revealing the most dangerous foods from the 60s, dishes that were once proudly served at dinner tables, yet became so controversial and risky they were banned forever. Get ready for an eye-opening look into a bygone era where curiosity sometimes trumped caution, and discover the stories behind these forbidden bites that vanished from our plates. Number 1. Green sea turtle soup. Green sea turtle soup gained a peculiar reputation in certain pockets of 1960s dining culture, appearing on the menus of upscale establishments and at elaborate social gatherings. While this dish never achieved mainstream status in every American household, it was valued by a niche clientele eager to sample something that symbolized refined exoticism. Prior to the global push to protect endangered species, green sea turtle meat could still be sourced by specialized suppliers who catered to restaurants or private individuals determined to showcase a luxurious menu item. Chefs often prepared the soup by simmering large pieces of turtle meat in a stock enriched with aromatic vegetables, thyme, bay leaves, and white wine, infusing it with a robust, savory character. Some recipes also called for sherry to add a layer of sweetness. When plating, the soup would be served in shallow bowls, sometimes garnished with fresh herbs or a dollop of cream, as the 1960s aesthetic leaned toward elegance and presentation. Enthusiasts praised green sea turtle soup for its dense, meaty taste that allegedly combined elements of fish, chicken, and veal all at once. Gastronomic publications and certain culinary circles in that era delighted in the idea of introducing new, seemingly sophisticated proteins to patrons who wanted to push beyond the boundaries of conventional dining. People who could afford to indulge in this dish often described it as a conversation piece, as much as a meal, reflecting a sense of status or cosmopolitan flair. However, the same networks that supplied turtle meat to these restaurants were contributing to unsustainable hunting practices, especially considering that demand outpaced the slow reproductive cycle of sea turtles. By the end of the decade, environmental advocates and marine scientists increasingly warned about plunging turtle populations, flagging them as at risk for extinction if harvesting continued unregulated. Not long after these conservation alarm bells rang, a large-scale global consensus emerged regarding the urgent need to protect sea turtles. International treaties and stricter domestic laws effectively criminalized capturing green sea turtles for commercial purposes in many regions, including the United States. Diners who had once considered turtle soup an extravagant delight were suddenly confronted with ethical and ecological implications. Restaurants that had prided themselves on offering it quietly removed it from their menus, acknowledging both legal risks and shifting public sentiment. News segments of the 1970s often spotlighted cases of poachers caught smuggling turtle meat, painting a stark picture of the lengths some would go to profit from endangered species. As a result, green sea turtle soup joined a list of banned dishes that captured the zeitgeist of a changing nation, one transitioning from naive indulgence to heightened awareness of humanity's toll on wildlife. Today, references to green sea turtle soup linger only in vintage cookbooks or culinary history discussions, serving as a telling example of how quickly a prized item can vanish from the gastronomic landscape once the broader consequences become apparent. Number 2. Whale meat steak. Whale meat emerged as an oddity in mid-century menus, occasionally crossing into the American culinary scene, though it was never as commonplace as beef, pork, or poultry. Nevertheless, the 1960s were a decade marked by curiosity and global exploration, partly due to rising travel opportunities and growing fascination with international traditions. A few daring restaurateurs believed that offering whale steak would position them at the forefront of cutting-edge cuisine, especially in port cities or near enclaves of adventurous diners. Whale meat steaks, usually sourced from larger species like fin whales or even occasionally from the beloved humpback, were typically sliced into thick fillets and cooked similarly to beefsteaks. Some preparations recommended a simple pan-sear in butter, seasoned with salt and pepper, while others marinated the meat in wine or vinegar-based sauces to tame any fishy undertones. Diners who sampled whale steak out of novelty or genuine culinary interest often remarked that it had a unique density and an almost beef-like texture. Enthusiasts who championed whale steak sometimes argued that it represented a sustainable marine protein, not fully grasping how large-scale whaling operations were already pushing multiple whale species to the brink. The 1960s also witnessed the blossoming of the environmental movement in the United States. Documentaries and photographic evidence highlighting the severity of whale population declines turned public opinion sharply against the commercial hunting of these colossal mammals. By the early 1970s, the tide had definitively shifted as scientists and activists rang alarm bells about global whale stocks being on the verge of collapse. In response to public outcry, nations gathered to impose strict limits on whaling. International cooperation led to the establishment of protective measures under the International Whaling Commission, and the U.S. introduced domestic laws banning whale products. Restaurants or specialty markets that once flirted with the idea of whale meat faced moral and legal pressure to withdraw. By the late 20th century, nearly all whale species were under various categories of protection, making whale steak not only socially unacceptable, but also illegal in most jurisdictions. Although a handful of older diners might recall glimpses of whale meat on some progressive menu, that recollection is often intertwined with regret over ecological damage. It stands as a salient reminder that society's relationship to endangered species can pivot rapidly when awareness transforms into collective action. Number 3, Authentic Sheep Lung Haggis. Haggis, a defining dish of Scottish heritage, comprises ground sheep offal, liver, heart, and notably lungs, mixed with onions, suet, oatmeal, and spices, then encased in a sheep's stomach and boiled. In Scotland, it has a centuries-long history, iconic for its robust flavor and role in cultural festivities, like Burns Night. However, the United States took a very different stance on the contents of this beloved dish, particularly focusing on the inclusion of sheep lung. During the 1960s, Scottish immigrants and curious American foodies sparked a renewed interest in ancestral cuisine, prompting various import attempts for authentic haggis. Small specialty stores in some urban centers occasionally carried items for diaspora communities wanting to replicate traditional feasts. Chefs who aimed to offer genuine Scottish experiences at events or themed restaurants faced immediate challenges with American food regulations, which classified lungs as unfit for sale. The U.S. Department of Agriculture implemented strict guidelines intended to reduce the possibility of contamination and disease transmission, ultimately banning the sale of sheep lung for human consumption. While some might argue the risk was minimal with proper handling, the policy was absolute, effectively erasing the possibility of encountering real sheep lung haggis on licensed menus. By the late 1960s, frustrated Scottish expatriates would swap stories of how they could only obtain haggis if they smuggled certain components back from overseas or tried renegade butchers who skirted regulations. Recipes adapted to these constraints by omitting lungs altogether, making do with heart, liver, and beef or lamb trimmings in an attempt to replicate the texture. Despite these creative reimaginings, Scottish purists often argued it just wasn't the same, contending that the characteristic richness provided by lung was irreplaceable. For many baby boomers who experienced the wave of cultural curiosity in that era, encountering American haggis was often anticlimactic, especially if they had traveled abroad and tasted the authentic recipe. Even as interest in global gastronomy expanded during and after the 1960s, the ban on sheep lung in the U.S. never wavered, a policy that stands to this day. Haggis is still widely associated with celebrations of Scottish ancestry, but in the United States, traditional authenticity remains legally out of reach. This underscores a broader pattern. An age that embraced foreign culinary traditions still intersected with stringent food safety measures, forging a tension between cultural preservation and public health regulations. Number 4. Unripe Ackee and Saltfish. Ackee and saltfish is the national dish of Jamaica, deeply interwoven with the island's cultural identity. Ackee itself is a bright red fruit that bursts open when properly ripe, revealing yellow segments with a rich, creamy texture. Paired with salted codfish and sautéed in onions, peppers, tomatoes, and spices, it's a beloved comfort food among Jamaicans. In the 1960s, as travel between the Caribbean and the United States grew, certain neighborhoods with strong Jamaican communities introduced ackee and saltfish to adventurous locals. Small markets began to stock fresh ackee for customers intent on making the dish at home. Yet, unripe ackee poses a serious health hazard due to high concentrations of hypoglycin A, which can induce severe hypoglycemia and even death if improperly prepared. American authorities were quick to notice sporadic cases of ackee poisoning in individuals who didn't know how to handle the fruit. The Food and Drug Administration responded with stringent import restrictions, labeling raw ackee as a hazard unless it was adequately processed and tested. By the late 1960s, these controls effectively banned fresh ackee unless one could prove it posed no risk. For Jamaican immigrants and second-generation families, these rules forced them to rely on canned ackee, which underwent specialized processing to neutralize toxins. While it still permitted the dish to exist in the U.S., many lamented that canned ackee lacked the fresh flavor of the fruit in its natural state. During that period, some folks who had traveled to Jamaica or tasted authentic ackee upon visiting Caribbean friends questioned the necessity of banning all unripe ackee, given that local Jamaican practices included strict guidelines, never picking ackee until it naturally opens, discarding the pinkish interior membrane, and rinsing carefully. Yet from a regulatory perspective, trusting the general public to adhere to these steps was deemed too risky. Thus, unripe ackee was effectively banned, ensuring that any form reaching American shelves would be free of the toxin-laden bits. Even decades later, ackee's restricted status endures, although modern canning methods and better oversight have prevented the widespread health issues once feared. The story of ackee and saltfish in the U.S. highlights the tension between cultural authenticity and safety-based prohibitions, a relic of the 1960s effort to guard consumers from unfamiliar dangers lurking in imported foods. Number 5. Fugu, pufferfish, sashimi. The concept of fugu, or pufferfish, sashimi fascinated certain gastronomic circles in the West, especially during the 1960s when Japanese cuisine was beginning to pique American interest. Known in Japan for its delicate flavor and the thrill of consuming a dish that could be lethal if improperly prepared, fugu quickly became a sensational topic in magazines and word-of-mouth tales. Skilled fugu chefs in Japan undergo years of training and certification to ensure that the tetrodotoxin-laced organs, chiefly found in the liver and ovaries, are meticulously removed. A single slip can lead to paralysis and death, making fugu one of the world's most notorious delicacies. In the 1960s, a handful of high-end restaurants in major metropolitan areas toyed with the idea of including fugu on their menus to attract daring diners eager for bragging rights. However, these establishments soon discovered that importing raw pufferfish was subject to stringent regulatory oversight. At the time, U.S. laws were often patchy, but they were unified in the sense that unlicensed or uncertified handling of fugu was effectively disallowed. Without a clearly established training program in America to certify chefs, the only legal way to serve pufferfish was to import pre-cleaned fish from Japan or to have a Japanese fugu chef come over to oversee the process. Even then, authorities demanded proof that every organ had been removed and the flesh thoroughly washed. These complicated rules made it nearly impossible for any standard restaurant to maintain a steady fugu offering. Stories began circulating about clandestine fugu dinners hosted by private clubs or traveling Japanese chefs, usually accompanied by whispers of how one mistake could be fatal. Local newspapers sometimes played up the danger, while gastronomes insisted that the risk was part of the allure. By the time the 1970s rolled around, officials had tightened regulations even more, effectively banning all unlicensed fugu from the market. Health inspectors targeted any venue attempting to circumvent these rules, often imposing hefty fines or shutting down repeat offenders. While a few specialized places with properly trained staff managed to comply, most restaurants found the bureaucracy too steep a barrier. This transformation reflected not only the U.S. push to protect consumers from exotic toxins, but also a broader cultural shift. During the 1960s, Americans thrilled at the notion of forbidden or adventurous cuisine, but the potential for tragedy overshadowed the novelty. In the decades that followed, awareness campaigns about foodborne risks, plus increasing liability concerns, made fugu an even rarer sight in mainstream dining. Currently, only a small number of licensed chefs in select cities are permitted to serve pufferfish, and the entire operation operates under strict government guidelines. For many baby boomers who recall fugu as an almost mythical dish from the other side of the globe, it remains a symbol of how the 1960s thirst for culinary novelty gave way to more cautious, regulated dining experiences, a balancing act between gastronomic curiosity and the realities of public safety. All 5 of these dishes, green sea turtle soup, whale meat steak, Authentic Sheep Lung Haggis, Unripe Ackee and Saltfish, and Fugu Sashimi, harken back to an era where exploration, novelty, and occasionally reckless consumption were hallmarks of modern dining. By examining the histories of these banned or tightly regulated foods, one can observe the intricate dance between evolving scientific findings, moral considerations, cultural identity, and legislative action. From environmental advocacy that saved certain species from extinction, to public health regulations that shield consumers from lethal toxins, the story behind each banned item underscores a societal pivot. The 1960s were a decade rife with change and contradiction, a time when humans had unrestrained faith in technological progress and were increasingly eager to sample foods from around the globe, yet remained on the cusp of discovering the destructive consequences of unchecked exploitation and lax controls. Today, the memories of these dishes endure in collected recipe cards, old photos, and the anecdotes of those who recall them. They serve as artifacts of a transitional period, shedding light on how quickly once celebrated foods can vanish once legal frameworks and collective ethics catch up to the realities behind their production and preparation.